Well, every now and again, something happens that really catches you off guard, like a government actually appearing to be honest. And something as crazy as that actually happened recently when the West Australian government released some information, some data around vaccine adverse reactions. It was kind of hard to believe that it was actually real to start with, and it was only once I read an excellent blog post by a journalist by the name of Rebekah Barnett that it began to sink in for me that this data was actually real, it was actually authoritative, and we were looking at what I think is going to prove to be a watershed moment as history looks back on the consequences of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. I wanted to talk to the author of that blog post myself. Rebekah Barnett joins me right now here on the Aussie Wire. Rebekah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, well, firstly, congratulations. You are a trained journalist. It shows in your work. You've got an outstanding writing style. I've become a subscriber and a bit of a fan of your Substack. We'll put the link to that in the description of this video. But this particular blog post of yours drew attention to something really quite astonishing. Can you brief us what's contained in this data from the West Australian government?
Sure. So Western Australia is completely unique in the world. There are very few regions that were almost completely vaccinated before we had any COVID. We shut our borders. I mean, Australia shut its borders, but also Western Australia, we're incredibly isolated. And so we were able to actually just hermit off for several years, and we became known as the Hermit Kingdom. So essentially, we're the safety experiment for COVID vaccines because our data is unconfounded by COVID infection. So what we find in 2021 is that vaccine adverse event reporting increased in the rate at 24 times the normal rate of adverse event reporting for vaccines. So that means that COVID vaccines generated 24 times more, not in raw number, but in rate per 100,000 doses administered, more reports than all the other vaccines combined for 2021.
It's quite an astonishing thing, and anyone that wants to see these graphs in more detail can go to your Substack and to your blog and see them there. That's where I've got these from. But this is data directly out of a report released by the West Australian government. There's a couple of things that I find really quite astonishing here. Firstly, looking at this graph, you can see that gradual sort of annual heartbeat of when the flu vaccines roll out. More vaccines are being administered. Obviously, around that sort of April, May time, we see an uptick in adverse reactions. That's reasonably well expected. Can you, just looking at the graph with the naked eye, I'm just trying to pick, where does the COVID-19 rollout start? It's not obvious to me. Can you just help me to see that?
Look, I went back and I checked the data, and it's actually where the big red arrow is.
Yeah, because otherwise it was just too subtle. I would have missed it without that big red arrow. But the note that you've got there points out that the COVID-19 vaccine rollout started on the 22nd of that month, so almost at the end of that month. We just see a little teeny tiny uptick in that particular month. It's within the boundaries that we've seen from prior months with the flu rollouts, the flu vaccine rollouts. And then all of a sudden, from the following month, it just goes insane. We hear a lot of people telling us, I'm sorry, I just find this even hard to talk about because it just boggles my mind. A lot of people are trying to tell us there's nothing wrong with the COVID-19 vaccines, and I'll bring up this other graph here. This here is the smoking gun for me, Rebekah. Can you just talk people through who may not be used to reading graphs or reading statistics or understanding what this is talking about? Can you just talk us through what is this graph that you've lifted, as I understand it, directly from that West Australian government report? What is this telling us?
So this is telling us that in a normal year, they're getting to that normal safety reporting systems about 200 adverse event reports following vaccination in a normal year, and that the rate per 100,000 doses, and it's the rate that's important because obviously there were a lot more doses of COVID vaccine given than any other vaccination in any other given year. And that's what people often highlight when we pick up on the fact that there's an increase in adverse event reporting. There are two things that people want to bring up. One is, yes, but more doses were given. And so that's true. And what this table that you've pulled up is showing is actually the rate of adverse events reported per 100,000 doses. So this accounts for the increase in number. So you can see here, just under 10,500 adverse events were reported in that year for COVID-19 vaccines specifically, compared to 200 adverse events reported for all the other vaccines combined in Western Australia. So that's point one. Point two is people will say, yes, but a report isn't, correlation is not causation. You can't prove that these things were caused by the vaccine. And that is correct, although there's two counters to that. One is that we're comparing apples for apples here. So we were comparing reports for reports. Mm-hmm. So the intention behind surveillance systems like these is it's generally agreed that the intention is to show signals that then then indicate there needs to be further research. So this is showing a signal that 24 times the normal number of people are experiencing something that they perceive to be an adverse event following a vaccination, and that then warrants further investigation. The other thing I would say is that further on in this report, there actually are quite a few sections where the adverse events have been confirmed by the Vaccine Safety Clinic in Western Australia. So it's not correct to say that all of these reports have not been confirmed to be causally linked, because many of them actually have.
There's a third objection that I hear often, and I find very distasteful, if I'm quite honest, because, for reasons that I'll get to in a second. But people say, this is because there was such a big push for people to report adverse reactions. It's just because we're reporting the adverse reactions this time, so it looks a lot worse than the other vaccines. But what that is a tacit admission that the reactions to the other vaccines must be a lot higher. I mean, they have to pick their poison. Either the reactions to the other vaccines are being underreported, or this vaccine is creating more adverse reactions. It's kind of pick your poison, one or the other.
Yeah, it's also an incomplete view. It's true to say that there is some academic literature to suggest that an increased publicity around a reporting system may lead to more reports, and the report does reference one of those papers. So fair play. But if I were writing an academic paper on this, I would not get a pass if that was my full literature review. Because if you were to do a full literature review, you would also have to reference the literature on underreporting, which the literature finds that anywhere between an underreporting factor of anywhere between 10 to 100-fold. So being very conservative, we might say a 10-fold underreporting factor. Now, how much has the increased publicity around adverse events for COVID vaccines offset the underreporting factor? Don't know. I haven't actually seen anyone attempt to answer that question, and they haven't attempted to answer it in this report.
Well, as you say, the purpose of collecting and having a reporting system is to detect a signal. But Rebekah, clearly there is no signal to be detected here. I don't see any signal at all. Carry on, business as usual.
I need to point out too, when you say perhaps, if we are to say, okay, perhaps a increase in publicity has increased the number of reports. Well, we need to also offset that against just what happened in the real world. So October, I believe, is the highest month for adverse events reports that
let me get
graph.
Back there.
Now, what happened at the end of October in Western Australia was we had a hospital crisis. Our Premier went on the news, I think it was the 31st of October, or right at the end of the month, to say our hospitals are in trouble. We are just overwhelmed. And he said in that press conference, we think it might be a delayed reaction to COVID. Now, we had, I can't remember how many it was that month. I think it was 16 COVID cases that month in Western Australia, because we were having snap lockdowns. Every time there was a community case, our whole state would go into a lockdown for 3 days or 5 days. So we did not have COVID circulating in the community. When we did have COVID cases, it was generally quarantine from cases from travellers coming back in. So 16 cases that month, and we had a hospital crisis. But what we did have was hundreds and hundreds of, over 1,000 adverse event reports for October. And 57% of the adverse events reported in this document fronted at hospital. They were either treated in ED or they were admitted to hospital. So we know that over half of the adverse events reported, most likely, we know that 57% of the people who reported adverse events had to go to hospital.
Yeah, wow. I mean, and that puts a lie to the claim that other people make that, but most of these reports, most of these adverse reactions, it's very minor. Well, obviously many of them are fully recovered from, but if from the report 57% are actually going to hospital, then we know that a lot of those minor reactions are just simply not being captured in the data. They're just not bothering to lodge a report for minor reactions. This is really capturing the reactions that are at the more serious end of the scale, is it not?
Yeah, and we need to also remember that, yes, there was an increased publicity around adverse event reporting, but we also had a very hawkish kind of medical censorship going on. So I'm an interviewer for a group called Jab Injuries Australia. And in the interviews that I do with people who have documented vaccine injuries, most people report that their doctors strongly denied any potential for there to be for the vaccine to be causally linked. There was a very strong, in Western Australia, you were a pariah if you weren't vaccinated, and even people who were vaccinated and were injured were being labelled anti-vax, and anti-vax was like the worst possible thing you could be called at that time. So again, we need to offset any uptick in reporting due to publicity with the very strong pressure to not report or not be seen as suggesting that your ailments might be linked to the vaccine. And the doctors, there were many reports through my interviews of doctors being very unwilling to make those reports on behalf of patients.
That sadly is not unique to Western Australia, but certainly the overall circumstances of Western Australia were very unique. And in the process, through great suffering for many of the people of the great state of Western Australia, you have provided us with this remarkable data set that hopefully will open a lot of eyes and bring a lot of people around when it comes to this particular subject. Rebekah Barnett, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire. The link to your Substack will be in the description of this video. I do highly recommend people check that out, and this certainly won't be the last time we'll be seeing you on the Aussie Wire. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.